in the annals of those curious affairs in which my friend Mr. Zise, Sherlock Holmes, has, from time to time, exercised his singular powers of observation and deduction, there are few which impressed me more forcibly at the outset than the case, which the newspapers, with their customary flair for the dramatic, later dubbed "The Letter Delivered by a Dead Man." The very title suggests something of the supernatural, yet I can assure the reader that, as in all matters which came under Holmes's scrutiny, the solution lay not in the realm of the otherworldly, but in the far more fascinating domain of human cunning and deception. The autumn of 1893 had brought with it a particularly tenacious fog that seemed to cling to the very soul of London. From our comfortable sitting room at 220 Baker Street, the familiar thoroughfare below had been transformed into a ghostly canyon, where gas lamps struggled valiantly against the encroaching gloom, and the occasional hansom cab emerged from the yellow murk like some spectral leviathan before vanishing once more into the mist. It was weather that suited my companion's temperament perfectly, for Holmes had been in one of his periods of profound mental activity, though to the casual observer he might have appeared sunk in lethargy. For the better part of 3 days he had scarcely moved from his position in the velvet armchair, his long, angular frame folded into what seemed impossible angles, his keen, grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point on the ceiling. The violin lay neglected in its case, and even his beloved pipe remained untouched in the Persian slipper where he kept his tobacco. Yet I, having lived in intimate association with that extraordinary mind for so many years, recognized in that very stillness the most intense activity of his mental faculties. "You are quite right to be concerned about young Stamford's practice in Kensington," he said suddenly, without so much as shifting his gaze from the ceiling, though I had been sitting in complete silence for the better part of an hour, absorbed in the latest issue of the Lancet. I confess I started, nearly dropping the medical journal. "Really, Holmes, this is too much. I have said nothing whatsoever about Stamford or his practice." Holmes finally moved, uncoiling his limbs with fear, grace, and turning those penetrating eyes upon me, a slight smile played about his thin lips. "The human countenance, my dear Watson, is an open book to one who knows how to read it. For the past 20 minutes you have been sighing intermittently, a specific exhalation through the nose that you employ only when vexed by financial matters concerning your medical colleagues. Furthermore, I observed you circle an advertisement in that journal earlier, a notice for a partnership in an East End surgery. Since you received a letter from Stamford this morning, which you read with a distinctly furrowed brow, and since he established his practice in that notoriously expensive district, the deduction constructs itself." "Your powers never cease to amaze me," I replied, though I had long since grown accustomed to these demonstrations. "Though I must say, Holmes, you seem rather too energetic for a man who has barely moved in 3 days. On the contrary, Watson, I have been exercising my faculties most vigorously. The criminal classes of London appear to have taken a collective holiday, leaving me to occupy myself with theoretical problems. I confess I am bored to distraction." He reached for his pipe at last, his movements sharp with restless energy. "What I would not give for a problem worthy of—" His words were interrupted by the violent clattering of hooves upon the cobblestones below, followed by the screech of iron-shod wheels against stone. The sound ceased directly before our door, and Holmes froze, the match hovering halfway to his pipe bowl. "A private carriage?" he murmured, driven with considerable urgency at this late hour. "The horse is winded. They have come some distance at speed. A matter of pressing importance, I perceive." The heavy bell below jangled with unusual violence, followed by Mrs. Hudson's hurried footsteps and the opening of the street door. Heavy boots ascended the 17 steps to our quarters with stumbling haste, and our sitting-room door burst open to reveal a figure that might have stepped from the pages of old Gothic romance. The man who stood framed in our doorway was perhaps 30 years of age, dressed in the height of fashion with a heavy Ulster coat that dripped with condensation from the fog. His face, however, commanded immediate attention. It was pale as parchment, his eyes wide with a terror that bordered upon madness, and his breath came in short, ragged gasps as though he had run a considerable distance. "Mr. Holmes?" he stammered, his voice cracking with emotion. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" "I am he," Holmes replied with characteristic calm, rising and gesturing toward the chair opposite his own. "And this is my colleague, Dr. Watson, whose discretion is absolute. You appear to be in considerable distress, sir. Pray, be seated. Watson, perhaps you would be so kind as to pour our visitor some brandy." The stranger collapsed into the offered chair, rather than seating himself in it. Accepting the glass I provided with hands that trembled so violently, I feared he might drop it. He drained the spirit in a single draught, then looked from Holmes to myself with the desperate air of a drowning man who has glimpsed salvation. "My name is Arthur Pendleton," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am a junior partner in the law firm of Pendleton, Harthouse and Vane. But I come to you not in my professional capacity, Mr. Holmes, but as a man who fears he is losing his reason." Holmes had resumed his seat and was regarding our visitor with that peculiar intensity which always appeared when an interesting problem presented itself. "I have often observed, Mr. Pendleton, that those who fear for their sanity are generally the most rational among us. It is those who are certain of their mental clarity that one must watch. Now, what has driven you from your home on such a foul night?" The letter from beyond. Pendleton reached into the inner pocket of his coat with a shaking hand and withdrew a thick envelope of cream-colored paper. It was crumpled as though it had been clutched in a desperate grip for hours and bore the unmistakable signs of having been handled with considerable agitation. "A letter, Mr. Holmes," he whispered. "Delivered it to my private residence not 2 hours ago." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with interest. "And what is so remarkable about a letter that it should reduce a man of law to such a state?" "It is not the content alone that terrifies me, sir," Pendleton replied, his voice dropping to barely audible levels. "It is the sender." He placed the envelope upon the small table between us, and I observed that Holmes's attention was immediately captured by something in the handwriting. The address was written in bold, aggressive strokes that spoke of a forceful personality, yet there was something in the formation of the letters that seemed to disturb my friend. "This correspondence," Pendleton continued, a sob catching in his throat, "is from my senior partner, Mr. Silas Vane." Holmes Pig. Envelope? Examining it with that methodical precision I had witnessed countless times before. He held it to the light from our lamp, studied the postmark through his magnifying lens, and even went so far as to test the paper's texture between his long fingers. "I perceive no postmark," he observed. "Hand-delivered, then, the paper's of excellent quality, the sort used by successful professional men. The handwriting shows signs of agitation. Note the irregular pressure and the slight tremor in the descenders. Your Mr. Vine was clearly under considerable stress when he penned this, but I fail to see why such circumstances should produce the terror I observe in your countenance." "Mr. Holmes," Pendleton said, his voice breaking entirely, "Silas Vane has been dead for 3 days. I identified his body myself. I attended his funeral this very morning and saw the earth thrown upon his coffin." The silence that followed this revelation was profound, broken only by the crackling of our fire and the muffled sounds of the fog-shrouded street below. Holmes's expression remained unchanged, yet I observed that familiar glitter in his eyes that always appeared when he encountered a problem of unusual complexity. "Dead men do not write letters, Mr. Pendleton," Holmes said at length, his voice soft but carrying an edge of steel. "Therefore, we must determine either how a living man has managed so perfectly to mimic the hand of the deceased, or—" He paused, turning the envelope to reveal a seal of dark red wax. "Or we must discover why a dead man's final correspondence was delayed until after his interment. There is more," Pendleton continued, his composure cracking further. My butler informed me that the letter was not posted through the regular mail. A figure in a dark cloak appeared at my door, deposited this envelope in the letterbox, and vanished into the fog before my man could properly observe him. And the date, Mr. Holmes. Examine the date. Holmes withdrew the single sheet of heavy parchment from its envelope, and for the first time in many weeks I observed a genuine frown crease his brow. The letter was brief, written in the same agitated hand as the address, but it was the date at the top that caused Holmes to draw in his breath sharply. October 14th, he murmured. Today's date, written in the hand of a man who was buried at noon. He passed the letter to me, his eyes never leaving Pendleton's face. Pray, read it aloud, Watson. I should like to observe our client's reaction to his partner's posthumous words. The message was brief, but deeply unsettling. Oh, Arthur, they believe I am gone. They believe the secret died with me. They are gravely mistaken. The ledger they seek is not where they have looked. It lies hidden where the sinner seeks redemption, but finds silence. You must retrieve it tonight before they realize their error. Do not fail me in this, or the blood that stains my hands will stain yours as well. The truth must not die with me. S.V. Where the sinner seeks redemption but finds only silence. Holmes repeated thoughtfully, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. A riddle from beyond the grave, it would seem. Tell me, Mr. Pendleton, how did your partner meet his end? It was ruled an accident, Pendleton replied, though his hesitation suggested he harbored doubts. He fell from the balcony of his study at his country estate in Surrey. The fall broke his neck. Death was instantaneous, according to the physicians. There was no suspicion of foul play. He was alone in the room, and the door was locked from the inside. Holmes sprang to his feet with that sudden energy that never failed to electrify the atmosphere of our sitting room. He began to pace before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind clearly racing through the implications of what he had heard. A locked room, an accidental fall, a funeral attended by the deceased's colleagues, and now a letter written after death, delivered by a mysterious figure, speaking of hidden ledgers and blood-stained hands. What's in your coat, Mr. Pendleton? You must take us to your residence immediately. I wish to question your butler while his memory of this cloaked messenger remains fresh. And then he consulted his pocket watch. We have an appointment with the impossible. For if Silas Vane is truly dead, then someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to make us believe otherwise. The game, as they say, is afoot. As we prepared to venture into the fog-shrouded streets of London, I could not shake the feeling that we were about to embark upon one of the most perplexing cases of our long association. The very air seemed thick with mystery, and I found myself wondering whether we were dealing with an elaborate hoax or something far more sinister. Holmes, however, showed no such uncertainty. His eyes blazed with that fierce intelligence I had come to know so well, and I knew that whatever dark secret lay behind Silas Vane's impossible correspondence, my friend would not rest until he had unraveled every thread of the mystery. The fog seemed to part before us as we descended into the yellow gloom of Baker Street, as though London itself were eager to reveal the secrets hidden in its murky depths. The journey through the fog-shrouded streets to Upper Brook Street proved a study in contrasts. The warmth of our enclosed carriage against the chill opacity that had transformed London into a labyrinth of shadows and muffled sounds. Holmes remained silent for the first portion of our ride, his keen eyes fixed upon some invisible point, while Pendleton sat rigid with anxiety, the mysterious letter clutched in his trembling hands. "Tell me of Silas Vane's character," Holmes said suddenly, his voice cutting through the rhythmic clatter of hooves upon cobblestone. Was he a man who inspired loyalty or fear among his associates? Pendleton shifted uncomfortably. Fear, I should say, though he commanded respect. Silas was brilliant, perhaps the finest commercial lawyer in London, but he was utterly without sentiment. He often boasted that he held secrets enough to topple half the great houses of England. I always assumed he meant legal confidences, but lately his behavior had grown peculiar. He kept a black ledger with him constantly, locked it away each evening, and spoke of matters that would shake the foundations of society if revealed. And this ledger vanished upon his death. Completely, we searched his study thoroughly after the funeral. Whatever secrets it contained seemed to have died with him until tonight. Holmes nodded thoughtfully as our carriage drew to a halt before an elegant townhouse whose brass fixtures gleamed despite the enveloping murk. We were admitted immediately by a tall, distinguished butler whose composed demeanor suggested years of discreet service. "You are Graves, I presume?" Holmes inquired, his penetrating gaze taking in every detail of the man's appearance. "You received the mysterious correspondence this evening." "Indeed, sir, at precisely 7:30. I observed the approach through the drawing-room window, a cloaked figure moving with curious hesitation along our front path." "Hesitation, you say? Describe this precisely." Graves straightened, clearly gathering in his thoughts. The figure paused twice. "Sir, as though uncertain of the route, despite our path being perfectly straight and well illuminated. When the letter was deposited, I opened the door immediately, but the messenger had vanished completely into the fog." Holmes strode past the startled butler into the small front garden, producing his pocket lantern with characteristic swiftness. For several minutes he examined the pathway with minute attention, occasionally dropping to his knees to scrutinize details invisible to my less trained eye. At the iron gate, he spent considerable time examining the hinges before straightening with evident satisfaction. "Watson, observe this gate. What strikes you as noteworthy?" I examined the structure carefully, but perceived nothing unusual. "It appears ordinary, Holmes, though perhaps in need of maintenance." "Precisely. Yet our mysterious visitor opened and closed it without producing the characteristic creak that alerted Graves to the approach. Someone oiled these hinges within the past few hours." He turned to Pendleton with sharp intensity. "Has anyone from your household attended to this gate today?" "Certainly not. It has required attention for weeks." Then our messenger took considerable precaution to ensure silent approach until the precise moment he wished to be observed. Holmes knelt again near the doorstep, his lens catching fragments that glinted in the lamplight. "Watson, your medical expertise. Examine this residue near the scraper." I stooped beside him, observing a faint reddish-brown smear upon the stone. "Clay, I should say. Red clay, not the typical grime of London streets." "Excellent, Murren-rich soil from the southern counties, and this," he lifted a tiny, charred fragment with his tweezers. "Ash from a Trichinopoly cheroot, not a gentleman's tobacco. Our ghostly correspondent has recently walked through rural clay and smokes cheap cheroots. A most corporeal spirit indeed." Holmes rose, his eyes gleaming with that familiar light of discovery. "The letter spoke of a place where the sinner seeks redemption but finds only silence." "Pendleton, does this riddle suggest anything to your knowledge of Vane's habit?" Pendleton's face suddenly brightened with recognition. "This Jude's Athenaeum. It's a failing institution whose bankruptcy Silas was handling. He spent countless hours alone in their archives, claiming he needed absolute silence for his work. The building contains a disused chapel, where the sinner seeks redemption but finds only silence," Holmes repeated with evident satisfaction. "A library chapel. Perfect. Watson, we must make for St. Jude's immediately." "Oh, Mr. A's messenger may have vanished into the fog, but he has left a trail of clay and ash that leads directly to our next destination." The game grows more intriguing by the hour. The St. Jude's Athenaeum emerged from the fog like a monument to forgotten learning, its blackened stone facade bearing the scars of decades spent breathing London's industrial exhalations. The building squatted in a narrow court off Great Russell Street, where the gas lamps struggled feebly against the encroaching murk, and the very air seemed thick with the ghosts of abandoned scholarship. A melancholy sight, Holmes observed as our carriage drew to a halt before the iron railings. Once the pride of literary London, now reduced to housing the legal machinations of a dead man. Tell me, Mr. Pendleton, who maintains the premises in their current state? The trustees appointed a caretaker when the institution closed. Pendleton replied, producing a heavy key from his waistcoat. Mr. Tobias Griggs, formerly the night porter. Silas retained access for his bankruptcy proceedings, claiming the financial records required extensive examination in situ. Holmes examined the entrance with characteristic thoroughness, his keen eyes noting details that escaped my less trained observation. The heavy oak doors bore fresh scratches around the lock, and the hinges showed signs of recent oiling, despite the building's general neglect. Someone has been maintaining this entrance with considerable care, he murmured, testing the door's swing. Yet observe the windows. Boarded, neglected, clearly unused for months. Why oil the hinges of a door that serves only legal business? We entered through the main hall, a cavernous space where dust motes danced in the beam of Holmes's dark lantern. The silence was profound, broken only by our echoing footsteps and the distant settling of old timber. Yet something in the quality of that silence suggested we were not the first visitors to disturb it recently. Holmes knelt suddenly, his magnifying lens hovering over the marble floor. Watson, your observations on these markings? I examined the dusty surface and discerned several sets of footprints leading toward the rear of the building. At least 3 different individuals have passed this way within the last day or 2. The impressions are quite clear despite the general accumulation of dust. Precisely. Note the variations. One set shows the pointed toe and narrow heel of a gentleman's boot, expensive manufacture. Another displays the broader sole and deeper impression of working-class footwear. But this third set. He adjusted his lens with evident interest. Smaller, more delicate, yet the depth suggests considerable weight being carried. A woman, I believe, bearing something substantial. Pendleton shifted nervously behind us. A woman, but who could possibly have business here? The building has been sealed to all but essential personnel. That, Mr. Pendleton, is precisely what we must determine. Holmes rose, his hand moving instinctively toward his coat pocket, where I knew he kept his service revolver. The chapel lies ahead, I presume. Let us see what manner of redemption awaits us there. We traversed the empty reading room, passing between rows of dust-sheeted tables that stood like shrouded sentinels in the darkness. The air grew progressively colder as we approached the rear of the building, and I became aware of a faint, sweet scent that seemed oddly out of place in this tomb of learning. The chapel was a small, octagonal chamber stripped of its religious ornaments, but retaining an unmistakable aura of sanctity. Holmes's lantern beam swept across bare stone walls, simple wooden pews, and a modest altar before coming to rest upon a structure in the far corner that made him draw in his breath sharply. "Where the sinner seeks redemption but finds only silence," he quoted softly. "Behold, gentlemen, an old confessional booth, its purpose to receive whispered secrets in absolute privacy." The confessional was a relic of the building's earlier ecclesiastical purpose, its dark wood worn smooth by decades of penitent hands. Holmes approached it with the reverence of a scholar examining a precious manuscript, his fingers tracing the carved panels before drawing aside the moth-eaten curtain. The interior was cramped, containing only a simple wooden bench and a small shelf. But Holmes's attention was immediately captured by the floorboards, where his lens revealed fresh scratches and displaced dust. "Someone has been here very recently," he announced, inserting his penknife blade between 2 boards. With a soft click, a hidden panel sprang open, revealing a cavity beneath. "And they have taken what they came for." The space was empty, but Holmes examined it with meticulous care, his lens revealing scratches in the wood and a small fragment of blue cloth caught on a splinter. "Blue serge," he murmured, carefully preserving the evidence. "Common enough, but the weave suggests quality manufacture." Our mysterious visitor was well dressed, despite their clandestine activities. Suddenly, Holmes stiffened, extinguishing the lantern with a swift motion that plunged us into complete darkness. From somewhere in the building came the soft but unmistakable sound of a door closing, followed by cautious footsteps approaching through the main hall. "It appears," Holmes whispered, his voice barely audible, "that we are about to meet another player in this curious drama." The approaching footsteps grew more distinct with each passing moment, accompanied by the soft rustle of fabric and what sounded distinctly like the measured breathing of someone attempting to move with stealth. Holmes positioned us behind the stone altar, where the deep shadows provided adequate concealment while allowing observation of the chapel entrance. I felt the familiar weight of my service revolver, and noticed that Pendleton, despite his evident terror, had managed to compose himself sufficiently to follow our lead in absolute silence. A faint glow appeared at the doorway as our unexpected visitor entered, bearing a carefully shielded lantern. The figure moved with practiced familiarity through the darkness, clearly well acquainted with the building's layout despite the oppressive gloom that surrounded us. As the light swept methodically across the chapel's interior, I caught my first clear glimpse of the intruder and felt a genuine start of surprise. Before us stood a woman of perhaps 30 years, dressed in a traveling costume of dark blue serge that immediately recalled Holmes's earlier discovery of the fabric fragment. Her features, illuminated by the upward glow of her lantern, were refined and intelligent. High cheekbones, a determined jaw, and dark eyes that moved with the calculated wariness of someone accustomed to navigating dangerous situations. She proceeded directly toward the confessional with the certainty of one following explicit instructions. Holmes allowed her to reach the booth and discover the empty hiding place before stepping from our concealment, his own lantern suddenly blazing to life and flooding the small chamber with brilliant illumination. "Good evening, madam," he said with characteristic composure. "I fear you have arrived somewhat tardily to claim your prize." The woman spun with remarkable self-possession, her hand moving instinctively to her throat, though her voice remained perfectly steady when she spoke. "You are Sherlock Holmes, I presume. Your reputation precedes you, though I confess I did not expect to encounter you in such circumstances." "You have the advantage of me," Holmes replied, advancing slowly while his keen eyes catalogued every detail of her appearance and demeanor. "Perhaps you would be so kind as to identify yourself and explain your presence in a sealed building at this unseemly hour." "My name is Eleanor Marchmont," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "I served as private secretary to Mr. Silas Vane for 7 years, until his untimely death 3 days past. I am here because I received this." She produced from her reticule an envelope that caused Holmes to draw in his breath sharply. The cream-colored paper, the bold handwriting, even the dark red wax seal were identical to those of Pendleton's mysterious correspondence. "Another letter from beyond the grave," Holmes murmured, accepting the document and examining it with his lens. "Written in the same hand, bearing today's date, directing you to this precise location. Most illuminating." "You mean others have received similar communications?" Miss Marchmont asked, her composure finally showing signs of strain. "Mr. Pendleton here received an identical summons," Holmes confirmed, producing the first letter for comparison. "Both written today, both in your late employer's distinctive script, both referencing this confessional as the location of some hidden treasure. Yet, observe, Watson. The ink on Miss Marchmont's letter is fractionally darker, suggesting it was penned perhaps an hour before Mr. Pendleton's. I examined both documents, noting the subtle difference Holmes had detected. Someone has orchestrated a most elaborate deception, but to what end? To ensure that all interested parties would converge upon this location, Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming with that fierce intelligence I had come to know so well. Yet, someone arrived before either of you could claim the prize. The question becomes, who possessed sufficient knowledge of Mr. Vane's secrets to anticipate this hiding place? Miss Marchmont's face had grown pale in the lantern light. The ledger contained records of his most sensitive cases, information gathered through methods that were not always strictly within the bounds of legal propriety. If those secrets were to fall into malicious hands, then half the prominent families of London might find themselves subject to blackmail, Holmes finished grimly. A powerful motive indeed for ensuring the ledger's recovery. But I suspect our mysterious correspondent has not finished with us yet. He moved to the empty cavity beneath the confessional, examining it once more with meticulous care. From within the space, he withdrew a small white calling card bearing an address in Bloomsbury, written in an unfamiliar hand. "Number 47 Tavistock Square," he read aloud. "Come alone at midnight if you wish to learn the truth about Silas Vane's death. It would appear, my dear Watson, that our evening's entertainment has only just begun." The clock in the chapel tower struck 11 as we emerged from St. Jude's Athenaeum into the fog-shrouded street, the mysterious calling card weighing heavily in Holmes's pocket like a challenge thrown down by an unseen adversary. The address, number 47 Tavistock Square, hung between us with all the menace of a carefully laid snare. Yet I observed that familiar glitter in my friend's eyes that always appeared when he encountered a problem of unusual complexity. Holmes remained silent during our brief return to Baker Street, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that attitude of intense concentration I had learned to recognize as the prelude to some brilliant deduction. Once ensconced in our familiar sitting room, he threw himself into his armchair and reached immediately for his pipe, filling the bowl with that strong black shag tobacco he favored during periods of deep contemplation. "Watson," he said at length, breaking the silence with characteristic abruptness, "what strikes you as most significant about this evening's discoveries?" I considered the question carefully, reviewing the strange sequence of events that had unfolded since Pendleton's desperate arrival. The letters themselves seem most remarkable. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to forge Vane's handwriting with sufficient accuracy to deceive those who knew him intimately. "Precisely." Holmes sprang from his chair with that sudden energy that always accompanied a breakthrough in his reasoning. "Yet consider the implications. Both letters were written today, hours after Vane's funeral. Yet both reference events and locations that suggest intimate knowledge of his affairs. The paper is identical in both cases, from the same manufacturer, bearing the same watermark. But observe this curious detail. The ink shows minute variations in composition between the two documents, suggesting either different pens or deliberate temporal separation between the writings. He consulted his pocket watch, noting that the hour approached midnight. "The invitation specified that I come alone, but I have no intention of walking blindly into what may prove a carefully constructed trap. However, before we venture to Tavistock Square, there is someone we must consult." Holmes moved to his desk and withdrew a telegram that had arrived during our absence. "From my network of irregulars, young Wiggins has been most industrious. It appears that number 47 Tavistock Square is registered to one Horace Cipinakos, formerly employed as confidential clerk to the late Silas Vane. Within the hour, we found ourselves standing before the modest terraced house, its single lighted window casting a yellow rectangle onto the fog below. The door... instantly by a small, nervous-looking man in spectacles who peered at us with undisguised apprehension. "Miss Holmes," he squeaked, clearly recognizing my companion from the illustrated papers. "You are early. The note said midnight. Punctuality is a virtue I prefer to precision," Holmes replied smoothly, stepping into the hallway without invitation. "You are Horace Finch, I presume? Former confidential clerk to the deceased?" The man led us into a cluttered sitting room where papers were stacked in precarious piles on every available surface. The air smelled of stale tobacco and nervous perspiration, and Finch's hands fluttered like agitated moths as he gestured toward the chairs. "I didn't steal the ledger," he blurted out suddenly, though no accusation had been made. "I only wanted to protect myself. Silas was dangerous. He ruined people for sport. When he died, I thought I was safe. But then the letters started." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with predatory intensity. "You received correspondence from the deceased as well?" Finch nodded vigorously, producing a crumpled envelope from his pocket. "Yesterday morning. Uh, it told me to watch the Athenaeum tonight to see who came for the book. It said if I didn't comply, my own secrets would be exposed to the police. So you were the observer? Holmes murmured, examining the letter with his lens. Identical handwriting, identical paper. Tell me, Mr. Finch, what did you witness at St. Jude's before our arrival? The little man's face grew pale. I saw everything, Mr. Holmes. The cloaked messenger delivering letters, Miss Marchmont's arrival, Mr. Pendleton's carriage. But before any of you came, he paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. I saw someone else. The atmosphere in the room tightened perceptibly. Holmes remained perfectly still, but I could sense the sudden sharpening of his attention. Describe this person, he commanded softly. A tall man dressed in black, moving with a pronounced limp. He entered the chapel through the side door perhaps an hour before you arrived. He carried nothing when he went in, but when he left, he had a book under his arm, a black ledger. And you recognized him. Finch hesitated, his fearful eyes darting between Holmes and myself. The fog makes tricks of the eyes, Mr. Holmes, but it looked remarkably like Thomas Pendleton, Arthur's brother. The one who was supposed to have died in Australia 5 years ago. The revelation struck like a thunderbolt. I felt the very foundations of our investigation shift beneath us as Holmes absorbed this information with characteristic calm. Though I observed his knuckles whiten as he gripped his pipe. Thomas Pendleton, he repeated thoughtfully. Tell me, Mr. Finch, what do you know of the connection between Silas Vane and the Australian colonies? Vane handled some business there years ago. Mining claims, I believe. He spoke of a ghost from the colonies in recent months, someone who threatened to expose old secrets. He burned letters, postmarked from Melbourne, always after reading them with the greatest agitation. Holmes rose to his feet with renewed energy, his mind clearly racing through the implications of this revelation. The game has changed entirely, Watson. We are no longer hunting a ghost. We are pursuing a man who has returned from the dead to settle old scores. And unless I am very much mistaken, his next move will be tonight. The return journey to Baker Street provided Holmes with the solitude necessary for deep contemplation, and I observed that familiar intensity in his expression which always preceded his most brilliant deductions. The fog had thickened considerably to deteriorate. With Finch, transforming London into a vast, impenetrable maze where familiar landmarks became ghostly approximations themselves. Yet I sensed that my friend's mind was cutting through the metaphorical fog of our investigation with characteristic precision. The pieces are beginning to arrange themselves, Watson, Holmes declared as we settled into our comfortable sitting room. We have been witness to an elaborate theatrical performance, with letters from the grave serving as both script and stage direction. Yet the playwright remains hidden in the wings, manipulating his actors with masterful skill. He moved immediately to his desk, withdrawing several reference volumes and spreading them across the surface with methodical care. The colonial connection troubles me greatly. Finch mentioned mining claims, and the timing of Thomas Pendleton's supposed death suggests more than mere coincidence. We must examine the public records before proceeding further. Within the hour, Holmes had dispatched young Wiggins with instructions to access the mining exchange archives while he himself consulted his extensive files on Australian commercial ventures. The results proved illuminating in the extreme. The records revealed a partnership between Silas Vane and Thomas Pendleton in the Southern Star mining claim, registered in Melbourne 5 years previous. Most significantly, the notation beside Thomas Pendleton's name read, "Deceased, claim transferred to surviving partner," with a date corresponding exactly to reported mining accident. "Observe the elegant simplicity of it," Holmes murmured, his eyes gleaming with intellectual satisfaction. Vane orchestrated his partner's apparent death to seize the entire fortune. But Thomas survived, assumed a new identity, and has spent 5 years planning his revenge. The question becomes whether he succeeded in that revenge before his own apparent demise. Our analysis was interrupted by an urgent knocking at the door below, followed by Mrs. Hudson's hurried ascent. She appeared in our doorway with evident distress, bearing a telegram that had been delivered with instructions for immediate attention. "From Inspector Lestrade, sir," she announced breathlessly. "The boy said it was most urgent." Holmes tore open the message, his expression darkening as he absorbed its contents. "Lestrade requires our immediate presence at Arthur Pendleton's residence. There has been what he terms a significant development in the case. We found Upper Brook Street in considerable commotion, with several constables stationed at intervals along the thoroughfare. Graves admitted us with obvious relief, his usual composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled anxiety. "Thank Providence you've returned, gentlemen," he stammered. "Mr. Pendleton received another telegram not an hour after your departure." He read it with the most terrible expression, then rushed to his study. When he emerged, he was carrying his service revolver in a small traveling case. Holmes's jaw tightened perceptibly. The telegram. Do you still possess the envelope?" The butler produced the discarded wrapper, which Holmes examined with his customary thoroughness. The message had originated from Croydon, dispatched at 10:15 that evening. Though the contents were gone, Pendleton's reaction suggested information of the gravest importance. "We must search his study immediately," Holmes declared, leading us down the familiar corridor. Whatever intelligence that telegram contained, it prompted precipitous action. The study showed clear signs of hasty departure. The safe stood open, its contents scattered, while papers lay strewn across the desk surface. Holmes knelt beside the blotting pad, his lens revealing the faint impressions of recently written text. "Most illuminating," he murmured, holding the paper to the mirror above the mantelpiece. The reversed script became legible. "Thomas, I know what you've done. The warehouse on Ratcliffe Highway. This ends tonight." "So Arthur knows his brother lives," I observed. "But does he suspect Thomas of murdering Vane?" "More than suspect, I fear. Someone has orchestrated events to ensure a confrontation between the brothers. But whether that someone is Thomas himself or another party entirely remains to be determined." Holmes consulted his pocket watch with evident concern. "It is now approaching 2:00. If Arthur intends to meet his brother tonight, we may already be too late to prevent what could prove a fatal encounter." As we prepared to depart for the Docklands, Holmes gripped my arm with unusual intensity. "Whatever we encounter in those shadows, Watson, remember that we are dealing with individuals driven by powerful emotions. Grief, revenge, perhaps even madness. The truth of Silas Vane's death lies somewhere in that darkness, and I fear more blood may yet be spilled before we uncover it." The fog along Ratcliffe Highway possessed a character entirely distinct from the genteel mists of Mayfair. Thicker, more malevolent, laden with the acrid scents of coal smoke, tar, and the Thames' own peculiar miasma of decay. The warehouse district sprawled along the waterfront like some industrial necropolis, its abandoned structures looming against the night sky with skeletal menace. Holmes moved ahead with that swift, purposeful stride I had witnessed on countless dangerous expeditions, his tall figure cutting through the vapor with predatory grace. Inspector Lestrade, who had joined our party at Upper Brook Street, cast nervous glances at the shadows that seemed to writhe and shift in the uncertain light of the scattered gas lamps. "A devilish place for a confrontation," he muttered, his hand resting upon his truncheon. "Half the criminals in London could disappear into these alleyways without trace." "Precisely why it was chosen," Holmes replied, his keen eyes scanning the numbered facades until he halted before a particularly decrepit structure whose sagging timbers suggested imminent collapse. "Observe, gentlemen, fresh wheel tracks in the mud and two distinct sets of footprints. One shows the measured stride of a man approaching with grim purpose, the other the irregular pattern of someone moving under considerable emotional strain. The main entrance bore evidence of recent forced entry, a rusted chain cut through with bolt cutters that lay carelessly beside the door." Holmes examined them briefly, his magnifying lens revealing details invisible to my less trained observation. "Recently used," he murmured. "The metal filings are still bright, and there are traces of machine oil on the handles." Someone came prepared for this meeting, though they wished to maintain the appearance of spontaneous action. We entered the cavernous interior with extreme caution, finding ourselves in a maze of rotting crates and abandoned machinery. Yet from somewhere deeper within the structure, voices echoed with that peculiar clarity that vast empty spaces provide. Holmes led us forward with the stealth of a hunting cat until we reached a position behind a stack of ancient barrels that afforded clear observation of the central loading area. Two figures stood perhaps 20 feet apart, illuminated by a single lantern placed on an overturned crate between them. Arthur Pendleton's face was haggard with exhaustion and fear, his service revolver trembling in his grip as he aimed it toward his companion. The second man bore such striking resemblance to Arthur that their brotherhood was unmistakable. Yet time and hardship had carved deeper lines into features that had once been identical to his siblings. "5 years, Arthur," Thomas Pendleton said, his voice carrying the rough edge of colonial exposure. 5 years I spent in that hellish mine, presumed dead while Vane lived in luxury on what should have been our shared fortune. Did you never question how conveniently I perished, just as the claim began producing significant gold? Arthur's weapon wavered slightly. "I mourned you, Thomas. We all did. Mother died believing you were buried under 50 feet of rock. But if you survived, if you've been alive all this time, why maintain the deception? Why not return openly and claim what was rightfully yours?" "Because Vane held the legal documents," Thomas replied bitterly. "Because he had convinced the colonial authorities of my death and transferred ownership to himself as surviving partner. I had no proof of the conspiracy, no means to challenge his claims in court. I was legally dead, Arthur, a ghost with no standing in any tribunal." Holmes chose this moment to step from our concealment, his voice cutting through the tension with characteristic authority. "Yet you are very much alive, Mr. Thomas Pendleton, and your presence here tonight suggests you have discovered evidence sufficient to challenge more than mere mining claims." Both brothers spun toward us, Arthur's revolver swinging dangerously in our direction before recognition stayed his hand. Thomas remained perfectly still, though his eyes narrowed with calculation as he assessed this unexpected development. "Mr. Holmes," Arthur breathed, "thank Providence you've come. Thomas sent me a telegram claiming he possessed evidence of Vane's corruption, demanding this meeting. I feared—" He paused, his voice catching. "I feared he intended to exact the same vengeance upon me that he visited upon our senior partner." "On the contrary," Holmes replied calmly, advancing into the lamplight. "Your brother speaks truthfully when he denies responsibility for Silas Vane's death. Indeed, I believe he has been conducting an investigation of his own, using methods not entirely dissimilar to those I employ. Careful observation, methodical deduction, and the strategic manipulation of circumstances to force guilty parties into revealing themselves." Thomas nodded slowly, a grim smile playing about his lips. "You're as perceptive as your reputation suggests, Mr. Holmes. I needed witnesses, people who knew Vane intimately, to converge upon the evidence I had carefully preserved. The letters, the mysterious messenger, even the placement of the ledger, all elements designed to expose the truth about Vane's business practices and his eventual murder." "Murder?" Arthur lowered his weapon slightly. "But the inquest ruled it accidental." He fell from his study balcony. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. "Because the killer was someone he trusted implicitly," Holmes said softly. "Someone with intimate access to his private chambers, someone who knew his habits well enough to ensure the death would appear accidental." He paused, his penetrating gaze sweeping the shadows at the warehouse's periphery. "Someone who has been orchestrating events from the beginning, manipulating both brothers toward this confrontation while preparing to eliminate the final obstacles to a most profitable scheme." A slow, deliberate clapping emerged from the darkness beyond the lamplight, sardonic applause that sent chills down my spine. A figure stepped into the circle of illumination, and I felt my breath catch as I recognized the refined features and intelligent darkies of Eleanor Marchmont. "Magnificent deduction, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice carrying none of the distress we had witnessed earlier. In her gloved hand, she held a small but deadly revolver, its barrel moving steadily between the three men before her. "Though I confess I had hoped to conclude this affair without your interference. The Pendleton brothers were meant to destroy each other over Vane's ledger, leaving me free to disappear with the considerable fortune hidden in his private accounts." "The fortune stolen from the Southern Star Mine," Holmes observed, his hands remaining carefully visible. "Money that rightfully belonged to both brothers, transformed by Vane into the foundation of his legal empire. You discovered this, didn't you, Miss Marchmont? Your position as his private secretary gave you access to records that revealed the full extent of his criminal enterprise." Her smile was cold as winter fog. "He destroyed my father just as he destroyed the Pendletons, drove him to bankruptcy and suicide with manufactured evidence and forged documents. I spent 7 years in his employ, biding my time, gathering proof of his crimes. When Thomas began watching the house, I realized the opportunity for perfect justice had finally arrived." The warehouse fell silent, save for the distant lapping of Thames water against the wharf. In that moment of suspended tension, I understood that we stood at the precipice of a revelation that would reshape everything we thought we knew about Silas Vane's death and the intricate web of deception that had ensnared us all. Holmes remained perfectly still despite the weapon trained upon him, his penetrating gaze fixed upon Eleanor Marchmont with that cold, analytical intensity I had witnessed countless times when he confronted the guilty. Yet there was something different in his expression. Not the satisfaction of a puzzle solved, but rather the profound sadness of a man who recognized the tragic waste of considerable talents turned toward destruction. "Your performance throughout this affair has been masterful," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying genuine admiration despite the circumstances. "The trembling secretary at St. Jude's, the careful manipulation of evidence, the forged letters, all executed with remarkable precision. Yet you made one critical error that betrayed your involvement from the beginning." Eleanor's weapon never wavered, though her eyes narrowed with curiosity. "And what error might that be, Mr. Holmes? I took considerable pains to ensure every detail was perfect." "The fragment of blue serge caught on the confessional's splinter," Holmes replied. "You claim to have received your letter only hours before our encounter. Yet the fabric evidence suggested someone had accessed that hiding place days earlier. You retrieved Vane's ledger immediately after his death, then orchestrated the elaborate charade of mysterious correspondence to manipulate all parties toward eliminating each other, while you escaped with his hidden fortune." The confession and the locked room. Arthur Pendleton stepped forward, his face contorted with anguish and disbelief. "You murdered him, but how is that possible? The room was locked from inside, there were no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play whatsoever." Eleanor's composure finally began to crack, years of suppressed rage and carefully controlled hatred surfacing in her voice. "Because I was already there when he entered his study that evening, hidden behind the heavy velvet curtains while he worked at his correspondence, waiting for the perfect moment. When he stepped onto the balcony for his customary evening cigar, I confronted him with the evidence I had gathered. Proof of the Southern Star fraud, documentation of my father's destruction, records of dozens of ruined lives." Her voice grew harder, more bitter with each word. He laughed, Mr. Pendleton. "Your esteemed partner actually laughed when I accused him of murder. He offered me money, a share of the stolen fortune, if I would remain silent and compliant. When I refused, when I threatened to expose everything to the authorities, he attacked me. In the struggle, I managed to push him backward over the balcony railing. Justice at last, after 7 years of servitude to a monster." "And the locked door?" Holmes inquired with professional interest. "The service stairs," she replied matter-of-factly. "Concealed behind the bookcase in the study's eastern wall. Installed during the house's original construction to allow servants discreet access to the upper floors. I descended through the servants' quarters and departed through the kitchen entrance long before the gardener discovered the body. The study door remained locked from inside, supporting the verdict of accidental death. Thomas Pendleton had been listening with grim satisfaction, but now his expression shifted to something approaching sympathy. I understand your hatred of Vane. He destroyed my life as thoroughly as he destroyed your father's. But I was there that night, Miss Marchmont. I saw you enter the study through those French windows. I watched the entire confrontation unfold. Eleanor's face went pale. You were watching for months, Thomas confirmed. I had been observing Vane's household, gathering intelligence about his habits and security arrangements. When I saw you confront him with the ledger, I realized someone else shared my desire for justice. After you departed through the servants' stairs, I entered the study myself and retrieved the black book. I needed that evidence to prove my identity and reclaim my stolen inheritance, the trap springs. Holmes had been edging almost imperceptibly closer during this exchange, his movements so subtle that even I barely detected them. Your plan possessed a certain elegant symmetry, he acknowledged to Eleanor, yet you overlooked one crucial element, the psychological profile revealed by your forged letters. A dying man's final communications focus on resolution and the proper conclusion of affairs. Your forgeries spoke of secrets, threats, and ongoing manipulation, the concerns of someone very much alive and engaged in active scheming. Moreover, he continued, his voice taking on that sharp edge of certainty, the red clay found on your mysterious messenger's boots came from Surrey, specifically from the grounds of Vane's estate. You delivered those letters yourself, disguised in a cloak, creating the theatrical atmosphere of supernatural intervention while conducting a very mundane campaign of psychological manipulation. The tension in the warehouse had reached an almost unbearable pitch when Lestrade, who had been positioning himself with admirable stealth during Holmes's discourse, suddenly lunged forward with his truncheon. Eleanor spun toward the movement, her revolver discharging with a deafening report that echoed through the cavernous space. The bullet struck one of the ancient wooden beams overhead, sending splinters raining down as both Pendleton brothers rushed forward to assist. The struggle was brief but violent. Eleanor fought with the desperate fury of someone whose carefully constructed plans were crumbling around her, years of suppressed rage finally finding physical expression. Yet she was no match for three determined men, and within moments Lestrade had secured her wrists with his handcuffs, while I retrieved the fallen weapon, justice, and resolution. "You understand nothing," she hissed, her composure finally shattered completely. Vane destroyed lives without conscience and used the law itself as a weapon against the innocent. He deserved death, and I would do it again without hesitation if given the chance. Holmes regarded her with something approaching genuine sympathy. Your father's fate was indeed tragic, and Vane's crimes were manifold and inexcusable. Yet you have placed yourself beyond the law's protection by taking justice into your own hands. The ledger you possess may yet serve to expose his corruption and provide restitution to his victims, but your own actions have transformed you from victim to murderer. Thomas approached Holmes with evident gratitude, producing the black ledger from beneath his coat. You've solved a mystery that has consumed 5 years of my life, Mr. Holmes. This book contains everything: proof of Vane's fraud, documentation of the mining conspiracy, even the locations of his hidden accounts. Perhaps now I can finally reclaim my identity and restore my family's honor. The ledger will serve justice well, Holmes assured him. But tell me, when did you first suspect that Vane's death was not the accident it appeared? Thomas's expression grew thoughtful. When I learned of the timing, I had sent Vane a letter revealing my survival and demanding restitution only days before his death. The coincidence seemed too convenient, suggesting someone else had reason to silence him permanently before my claims could be investigated. When I observed Miss Marchmont's behavior in the days following the funeral, her nervous energy, her frequent visits to locations mentioned in his private papers, I began to suspect she knew more than she revealed. As Lestrade prepared to escort Eleanor Marchmont to the waiting police van, she turned back toward us with one final, desperate plea. "The money in those accounts represents stolen lives, Mr. Holmes. Whatever happens to me, ensure it returns to Vane's victims. Let some good come from this tragedy." Holmes nodded gravely. "Justice will be served, Miss Marchmont, though perhaps not in the manner you originally envisioned." The fog had begun to lift as we emerged from the warehouse into the pre-dawn darkness, revealing the first pale streaks of approaching daylight over the Thames. The case that had begun with impossible letters from a dead man had resolved into a tale of revenge, deception, and the terrible consequences of unchecked corruption. Yet as we made our way back toward the civilized streets of London, I reflected that while justice had been served, it had come at a considerable cost to all involved. The mystery of Silas Vane's death was solved, the Southern Star fraud exposed, and a brother presumed dead restored to life and legal standing. But in the growing light of dawn, I couldn't help but wonder whether the price of such revelations had been worth the human wreckage left in their wake. The days following Eleanor Marchmont's arrest brought with them that peculiar mixture of satisfaction and melancholy which always accompanied the resolution of Holmes's more complex cases. Though the immediate danger had passed and justice appeared to be taking its proper course, I observed in my friend that restless energy which invariably manifested when his extraordinary faculties were no longer required for active investigation. He spent long hours at our sitting-room window, his keen gaze fixed not upon the familiar bustle of Baker Street, but upon some internal landscape of unresolved contemplation. The architecture of deception. You seem troubled by the resolution, Holmes. I ventured on the third evening after our warehouse confrontation, finding him once again in his characteristic pose of deep reflection. Not troubled, Watson, but rather fascinated by the elegant complexity of what we witnessed, he replied, turning those penetrating grey eyes upon me. We have been privileged to observe the convergence of three entirely separate schemes, each pursuing justice through different means, yet all orbiting around the malevolent influence of Silas Vane. He rose and began that familiar pacing before the fireplace which always accompanied his most profound deductions. Consider the architecture of it all. Miss Marchmont's campaign of revenge, methodically planned over 7 years of servitude. Thomas Pendleton's patient investigation from beyond the grave, gathering evidence to reclaim his stolen identity. And finally, Vane's own scheme, for I am convinced he was planning his own disappearance when death intervened. His own disappearance? I asked, intrigued by this new perspective. Those burned letters from Australia that Finch mentioned were not merely threats, but complications in an escape plan already in motion. Vane knew Thomas lived, had known for months, perhaps years. When direct confrontation became inevitable, he was preparing to vanish with his ill-gotten fortune, leaving behind a carefully constructed death or disappearance while assuming a new identity abroad. Our discussion was interrupted by Mrs. Hudson's announcement of Inspector Lestrade, who entered bearing both official documents and several morning newspapers. His expression combined professional satisfaction with that grudging admiration he reserved for Holmes's more spectacular deductions. "The Commissioner sends his compliments, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade announced, settling into the chair I offered. "The Marchmont woman's confession has opened floodgates throughout the legal profession. We've already initiated investigations into half a dozen firms mentioned in that ledger." Holmes accepted the official papers with characteristic composure, though I observed his eyes brighten as he scanned their contents. "Most illuminating, Inspector. I see that Arthur Pendleton's examination of his late partner's private correspondence has yielded additional evidence." Indeed. Vane had been employing a private inquiry agent in Melbourne for over 2 years, monitoring Thomas Pendleton's activities while maintaining the fiction of his death. When Thomas finally sent that threatening letter, Vane knew exactly who he was dealing with and was already contemplating permanent solutions. This revelation cast Eleanor Marchmont's actions in an even more tragic light. Her confrontation with Vane had occurred at the precise moment when he was most dangerous, cornered by Thomas's threat and desperate to eliminate all obstacles to his planned escape. The wheels of justice. The trial of Eleanor Marchmont became the sensation of the season, with every newspaper in London providing detailed coverage of proceedings at the Old Bailey. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators drawn by the extraordinary circumstances of the case, a woman of refinement and intelligence driven to murder by years of systematic deceit. Oppression, facing judgment for killing a man whose crimes had destroyed countless lives. Holmes declined to attend the proceedings personally, though he followed every development through the press with characteristic attention to detail. "The law must take its course, Watson," he observed, when I suggested we might witness the testimony. Our role was to uncover the truth. The courts must now determine how that truth translates into justice. The evidence was overwhelming, yet the circumstances provided considerable mitigation. Thomas Pendleton's testimony regarding Vane's awareness of his survival and apparent plans for permanent silencing painted a picture of a man driven to increasingly desperate measures. The ledger's revelations of systematic fraud and deliberate destruction of innocent lives generated substantial public sympathy for his killer. The verdict, when it came, reflected these complexities, guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, with the jury accepting that Eleanor had acted under extreme provocation when Vane physically attacked her. The sentence was severe, 15 years of penal servitude. Yet not the capital punishment that many had expected. Restoration and redemption. Thomas Pendleton, his legal identity fully restored through the evidence we had secured, proved himself a man of remarkable character in the aftermath of these revelations. Rather than simply reclaiming his stolen fortune, he established a comprehensive trust fund dedicated to compensating the victims of Vane's various schemes. Most poignantly, a substantial portion was allocated specifically to clear the debts that had driven Eleanor's father to suicide, a gesture of posthumous justice that spoke volumes about the man's essential nobility. Arthur Pendleton, though shaken by the revelations about his former partner, embraced his brother's return with genuine joy. Together, they began the arduous process of rebuilding the family firm on foundations of absolute integrity, purging every trace of Vane's corruption and working to restore the Pendleton name to its former honor. The broader impact of the case reverberated throughout London's financial circles for months. The ledger's contents led to the resignation of 3 prominent bank directors, the reopening of numerous bankruptcy cases, and the posthumous destruction of Silas Vane's reputation. What had once been regarded as sharp legal practice was now revealed as systematic criminal enterprise. A final message. Perhaps the most poignant epilogue to our adventure arrived several weeks after the trial's conclusion, a small package bearing the postmark of Holloway Prison. Inside was a delicate silver locket containing the miniature portrait of an elderly gentleman with kind eyes, accompanied by a brief note written in Eleanor Marchmont's elegant hand. "Mr. Holmes, you saw the truth when others saw only the crime. For that, and for ensuring my father's memory is finally cleared of shame, I remain eternally in your debt. The law has judged me, but you understood me. E.M." Holmes examined the locket in thoughtful silence before placing it carefully in the drawer where he preserved mementos of his most singular cases. "A remarkable woman, Watson," he murmured, "possessed of a mind that under different circumstances might have achieved extraordinary things. It is perhaps the greatest tragedy of our profession that we so often encounter brilliance only after it has been twisted by injustice into the service of crime." The game continues. As if summoned by the completion of one mystery, Inspector Lestrade appeared at our door that very afternoon, his face flushed with excitement over some new development in the ongoing battle against London's criminal classes. Holmes welcomed him with that characteristic smile that suggested both amusement and genuine affection for the earnest inspector. "I trust, Lestrade," Holmes said with evident good humor, "that your latest case does not involve correspondence from deceased individuals. I find myself quite satisfied with our recent experience in that particular realm of impossibility." The inspector looked puzzled by the reference, while I suppressed a chuckle at my friend's subtle humor. The case of the letter delivered by a dead man had reached its conclusion, but in the great, sprawling narrative of London life, new mysteries were always emerging from the fog-shrouded streets, waiting to challenge the unique faculties of Sherlock Holmes. And as I watched him listen with characteristic attention to Lestrade's excited account of stolen diamonds and mysterious midnight meetings, I knew there was no place in the Bay world I would rather be than here in our comfortable rooms at Baker Street, ready for whatever impossible puzzle the city might present to us next. The game, as Holmes was so fond of saying, was eternally afoot. The November fog, au bazou, had settled upon London with unusual persistence, transforming Baker Street into a ghostly thoroughfare where gas lamps struggled against the encroaching gloom. From our familiar sitting room, I could observe the occasional horn on a hansom cab, materializing from the yellow murk like some phantom vessel, before vanishing once more into the mist. It seemed fitting weather for reflection upon the extraordinary case that had consumed our attention these past weeks. A mystery that had begun with impossible correspondence from us beyond the grave, and concluded with revelations that struck at the very foundations of legal propriety in London. Holmes occupied his customary position in the velvet armchair, his long frame folded in that characteristic attitude of repose that I had learned to recognize as the aftermath of intense mental exertion. The violin lay within easy reach, though for the moment he seemed content to contemplate the dancing flames in our fireplace. The pipe between his fingers sent thin spirals of smoke toward the ceiling, and I observed that familiar expression of profound contemplation that always followed the resolution of our more complex investigations. "You are thinking of Eleanor Marchmont," I ventured, setting aside the manuscript pages I had been reviewing. Holmes stirred slightly, his keen gray eyes focusing upon me with that mixture of amusement and approval I had come to treasure. "Your powers of observation continue to develop admirably, Watson. Indeed, Miss Marchmont has occupied my thoughts considerably since her trial concluded. There was in that woman a quality of tragic determination that one encounters rarely in our profession." "She was undeniably brilliant," I agreed. "To maintain such an elaborate deception while serving the man she despised required extraordinary strength of character, however misdirected." "Precisely the point that troubles me," Holmes replied, rising to pace before the fireplace with renewed energy. "We witnessed the convergence of three separate quests for justice: Thomas Pendleton's methodical investigation, Eleanor's campaign of revenge, and even Vane's own scheme to escape the consequences of his crimes. Each pursued their goal with remarkable intelligence, yet only one chose the path of legal remedy over personal vengeance." He paused, his penetrating gaze fixed upon some invisible point beyond our walls. "The tragedy lies not merely in Eleanor's crime, but in the systematic failure of institutions that should have protected her father and countless others. When the law becomes the instrument of oppression rather than justice, it creates the very conditions that breed vigilantism. The broader consequences. Weeks following Eleanor Marchmont's sentencing had brought a cascade of revelations that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of Silas Vane's death. Thomas Pendleton's black ledger had proven to be merely the visible portion of a vast iceberg of corruption. The comprehensive audit of Vane's affairs, conducted by a team of independent investigators, revealed a network of fraudulent schemes that had destroyed hundreds of lives over more than a decade. "The compensation fund grows daily," Holmes observed, consulting a letter that had arrived that morning from Thomas Pendleton. "The recovered assets now exceed £150,000, with more being discovered as investigators trace the web of shell companies and hidden accounts. Thomas has proven himself a man of remarkable integrity. Every penny recovered goes directly to Vane's victims with no consideration for personal enrichment. And Arthur Pendleton, rebuilding the family firm on foundations of absolute honesty, though the process has proven more challenging than anticipated." The Pendleton name was so thoroughly associated with Vane's practices that several clients have withdrawn their business entirely. Yet both brothers seemed determined to restore their family's honor through deed rather than mere protestation. The most poignant development had come in the form of a petition submitted by Arthur Pendleton on Eleanor Marchmont's behalf. The newly discovered evidence of Vane's far more extensive crimes had provided grounds for appeal, and the court had reduced her sentence to 10 years with the possibility of earlier release. She had written to Holmes once more, a brief note expressing gratitude not for the legal victory, but for the vindication of her father's memory. The price of understanding. "There is a lesson here, Watson," Holmes said, settling back into his chair and reaching for his violin. "We pride ourselves on bringing truth to light, on solving the unsolvable, and explaining the inexplicable. Yet truth, once revealed, carries consequences we cannot always predict or control. Eleanor Marchmont sought justice for her father and found it at the cost of her own freedom and peace of mind." "You sound almost regretful," I observed. Holmes tested the violin's tuning with a few experimental notes before responding. "Not regretful, but sobered by the recognition that our work exists at the intersection of human passion and cold logic. We can untangle the threads of deception, but we cannot always weave them back into patterns that bring happiness to those involved." He drew the bow across the strings, producing a haunting melody that seemed to capture the melancholy atmosphere of our fog-shrouded evening. The music filled the room with that peculiar combination of beauty and sadness that characterized his most reflective moods. "The case is closed," he continued between phrases. "Yet its implications continue to resonate. 3 more law firms are under investigation based on information from Vane's records. The mining exchange has implemented new verification procedures for colonial claims. Even Scotland Yard has begun reviewing cases where Vane served as legal counsel, seeking evidence of improper influence. The eternal game." As the evening progressed and the fog thickened beyond our windows, I found myself reflecting upon the strange journey that had brought us from that first desperate visit by Arthur Pendleton to this quiet moment of resolution. The supernatural had been revealed as entirely human, the impossible made logical through careful observation and deduction. Yet the human cost of that revelation continued to weigh upon both our minds. "You will write this case, of course?" Holmes asked, setting aside his violin as the clock struck 10. "If you approve the account," I replied, though I confess I struggle with how to present Eleanor Marchmont's actions. She was simultaneously victim and perpetrator, hero and criminal. Present her as she was, a woman of extraordinary intelligence and determination who chose the wrong path toward a just goal. Let the readers draw their own moral conclusions. Our role is to illuminate the facts, not to serve as judges of character." A sharp knock at our door interrupted the conversation, followed by Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread upon the stairs. She appeared bearing a telegram marked "Urgent," which Holmes accepted with that sudden alertness that always accompanied the prospect of a new case. "From Inspector Lestrade," he announced after scanning the contents. "It appears a prominent banker has vanished from his locked study, leaving behind only a cryptic note and a room that shows no signs of forced entry. The family insists he would never abandon his responsibilities voluntarily." Holmes's eyes brightened with that familiar gleam of intellectual hunger. "Another impossible disappearance, Watson. Shall we see what mundane explanation lies behind this latest apparent miracle?" As we prepared to venture once more into the fog-shrouded streets of London, I reflected that while the case of the letter delivered by a dead man had reached its conclusion, the eternal struggle between order and chaos, justice and corruption, truth and deception continued unabated. Somewhere in that vast city, new mysteries were already forming, new challenges awaiting the unique faculties of Sherlock Holmes. The fog seemed to part before us as we descended into Baker Street, as though London itself were eager to reveal whatever secrets lay hidden in its murky depths. Behind us, the warm glow of our sitting-room windows promised eventual return to comfort and reflection. But ahead lay the unknown, the impossible, and the irresistible call of the game that would forever be afoot. Final reflections. In the years that have passed since these events, I have often contemplated the lessons embedded within this singular case. The letter delivered by a dead man taught us that the most elaborate deceptions often spring from the simplest human emotions: love, grief, and the desperate desire for justice. When legal remedies fail, Eleanor Marchmont's tragedy was not that she lacked the intelligence to pursue her goals through proper channels, but that those channels had already failed her so completely that vengeance seemed the only remaining option. Thomas Pendleton's resurrection from legal death to living vindication proved that patience and methodical investigation could achieve what violence never could. His choice to pursue restitution rather than revenge transformed him from victim to victor, while Eleanor's opposite choice led from justified anger to criminal conviction. Yet, perhaps the most profound lesson lay in recognizing that behind every impossible mystery stands a very human truth, waiting for the proper combination of logic and understanding to bring it to light. In our fog-shrouded city of secrets, Sherlock Holmes remained the eternal beacon, cutting through deception with a sharp blade of reason, revealing the human heart that beats beneath even the most elaborate facade of impossibility. The case was closed, but the story, like all the best stories, would continue to resonate in the minds of those who encountered it, a reminder that truth, however painful, remains preferable to the most comfortable of lies. The winter months that followed brought with them a peculiar quality of reflection, as though the case of the letter delivered by a dead man had settled into the very atmosphere of our Baker Street lodgings like smoke from Holmes's pipe. I observed in my friend a subtle but unmistakable change, not in his methods, which remained as sharp and logical as ever, but in his understanding of the human heart that beat beneath even the most elaborate criminal schemes. "Watson," he remarked one grey February morning, setting aside a letter that had arrived with the post, "I find myself increasingly convinced that our profession offers us a unique vantage point from which to observe the eternal struggle between justice and mercy." This correspondence from Miss Marchmont illustrates the point admirably. He passed me the carefully written pages, which I read with growing interest. Eleanor Marchmont wrote from Holloway Prison with remarkable composure, describing her work in the prison library and her efforts to assist fellow inmates with legal correspondence. Most significantly, she had begun collaborating with a committee of legal reformers, contributing her intimate knowledge of Silas Vane's methods to help identify and prevent similar abuses in the future. "She has found purpose even in confinement," I observed. "Perhaps there is hope for her redemption after all." "More than hope, I believe. I have received unofficial word that the Home Office is considering early release provisions for prisoners who contribute meaningfully to legal reform efforts. Miss Marchmont's unique insights into commercial legal corruption have proven invaluable to their ongoing investigations." Our discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas Pendleton, whose transformation from the haunted figure we had first encountered continued to astonish me. He carried with him a substantial ledger, bound in green leather, which he placed upon our table with evident satisfaction. "The final accounting," he announced. "Every victim of Vane's schemes has now received compensation from the recovered assets. The total distribution exceeds £200,000. Watson, money that has restored bankrupted businesses, cleared fraudulent debts, and provided pensions for families, is destroyed by his machinations." Holmes examined the ledger with genuine admiration. "You have achieved something remarkable, Mr. Pendleton. This represents justice in its truest form, not merely punishment of the guilty, but restoration for the innocent." "Arthur and I have found unexpected satisfaction in this work," Thomas replied. "We began seeking personal vindication, but discovered that healing others' wounds has somehow healed our own. The firm prospers now, built upon foundations of transparency that would have horrified our former partner." After Thomas departed, Holmes moved to his desk and withdrew the silver locket that Eleanor had sent months earlier. He held it to the light, studying the miniature portrait of her father with that intense concentration he reserved for the most significant evidence. The ripples of this case continue to spread far beyond our initial investigation, he mused. The Law Society has implemented new oversight procedures. Parliament has strengthened regulations governing colonial partnerships. 3 additional firms have been investigated and reformed based on information from Vane's records. One could argue that Miss Marchmont's crime, however tragic in its immediate consequences, has ultimately prevented far greater injustices. You sound almost approving of her actions, I ventured. Holmes replaced the locket carefully in its drawer. Not approving, Watson, but understanding. There is a difference between condoning crime and recognizing the circumstances that drive otherwise decent people to desperate acts. Our legal system must evolve to address not merely the symptoms of criminality, but the conditions that create them. A sharp knock interrupted our philosophical discourse, followed by Mrs. Hudson's announcement of Inspector Lestrade. The inspector entered, bearing the familiar expression of professional frustration that invariably preceded his requests for Holmes's assistance. "Gentlemen," he announced without preamble, "we have another impossibility on our hands. A locked library, a missing manuscript worth thousands of pounds, and a night watchman who swears he heard voices from an empty room. The British Museum is in an absolute uproar." Holmes's eyes brightened with that familiar gleam of intellectual hunger. "Another locked-room mystery, Lestrade? How delightfully consistent London's criminals prove to be in their choice of theatrical impossibilities." As we prepared to venture forth into the February afternoon, I reflected upon the strange journey that had brought us from Silas Vane's impossible correspondence to this moment of renewed purpose. The case had taught us that behind every mystery, however elaborate, lay fundamental human truths about justice, revenge, and redemption. Eleanor Marchmont had sought to answer injustice with violence. Thomas Pendleton had chosen the harder path of legal restoration, and Holmes himself had discovered new depths in awe, his understanding of human motivation. The fog was lifting from Baker Street as we descended to meet whatever new impossibility awaited us, carrying with us the hard-won wisdom that truth, however complex, remained preferable to the most comfortable deceptions. The game was indeed eternally afoot, but we approached it now with a deeper appreciation for the human heart that beat beneath even the most puzzling circumstances. Behind us, the warm glow of our sitting-room windows promised eventual return to comfort and contemplation. Ahead lay the unknown and the irresistible challenge of transforming the impossible into the merely improbable through the careful application of logic, observation, and, perhaps most importantly, understanding. The spring of 1894 brought with it an unexpected warmth to London, as though the city itself sought to wash away the lingering shadows of that fog-shrouded November when the case of the letter delivered by a dead man had first drawn us into its web of deception. From our Baker Street windows, I observed Holmes standing in contemplation, his lean figure silhouetted against the gentle morning light that transformed our familiar sitting room into something almost ethereal, the fruits of justice. "A most satisfactory conclusion," Holmes announced, setting aside the morning correspondence with evident pleasure. "Thomas Pendleton writes to inform us that the Compensation Fund has now distributed its final payments, over £200,000 returned to the victims of Silas Vane's systematic corruption. More significantly, his brother Arthur has been elected to the Law Society's new Ethics Committee, a position from which he can ensure that such abuses never again flourish, unchecked." I looked up from my medical journals, genuinely moved by this news. The transformation of the Pendleton brothers from victims of circumstance to architects of reform represented perhaps the most satisfying aspect of our entire investigation. "And Miss Marchmont?" I inquired, though Holmes's expression already suggested positive developments. "Released under the new reform provisions," he replied, producing a second letter from the morning's post. "She will complete her sentence through supervised work with the Legal Aid Society, providing legal assistance to those who cannot afford a proper representation." The Home Office concluded that her unique insights into commercial corruption could serve society more effectively than continued imprisonment. Holmes moved to his desk and withdrew from a locked drawer the small collection of artifacts we had preserved from the case. The forged calling card, the fragment of blue serge, the silver locket containing Eleanor's father's portrait. He arranged them carefully upon the table between us, each item a tangible reminder of the human drama that had unfolded around Silas Vane's malevolent influence. The architecture of understanding. "I have been reflecting considerably upon this affair, Watson," he said, settling into his chair with that characteristic intensity I had learned to recognize as the prelude to his most profound observations. "We began with what appeared to be a supernatural impossibility, correspondence from beyond the grave. We concluded with a very human tragedy of justice delayed and revenge misdirected. Yet the true revelation was not who committed the crime, but why the crime became inevitable." He picked up the locket, studying the miniature portrait within. "Consider the complete architecture of what we uncovered. Vane's systematic corruption created victims across 2 continents. His destruction of Eleanor's father drove her to 7 years of patient planning, culminating in murder. His fraud against Thomas Pendleton resulted in 5 years of legal death and painstaking investigation. Each player pursued their own conception of justice: legal manipulation, righteous restoration, personal retribution. And which proved most effective?" I asked, though I suspected I knew his answer. "Paradoxically, all of them," Holmes replied with that slight smile which indicated a particularly satisfying deduction. "Vane's methods ultimately exposed their own corruption. Eleanor's crime, however tragic, forced the examination that revealed the full extent of systematic abuse. Thomas's methodical investigation provided the evidence necessary for comprehensive reform. The convergence of these 3 approaches created conditions for justice more complete than any single method could have achieved." Our philosophical discourse was interrupted by the arrival of a package bearing the seal of the Law Society. Inside was a slim volume bound in green leather, its pages filled with elegant handwriting. The accompanying note was brief but significant. "Mr. Holmes, my analysis of legal corruption, compiled during confinement and now published as The Architecture of Legal Abuse, a Study in Systematic Reform, has been adopted as required. Reading for all new solicitors. I wanted you to have the first copy, with gratitude for proving that truth, however painful, remains our most powerful weapon against injustice. Eleanor Marchmont, The Continuing Game." Holmes examined the volume with genuine admiration, noting the dedication. "To my father, whose memory deserves better than my vengeance provided, and to those who seek justice through law rather than lawlessness. She has transformed personal tragedy into public service," he murmured. "Perhaps that represents the truest form of redemption, not forgetting one's crimes, but ensuring they serve some greater purpose." As if summoned by the completion of one chapter, Inspector Lestrade appeared at our door that very afternoon, his familiar expression of professional frustration preceding his request for assistance. "Gentlemen, we have another impossibility. The British Museum reports a missing manuscript worth thousands of pounds, taken from a locked room where the night watchman swears he heard medieval chanting. The curator is beside himself." Holmes's eyes brightened with that familiar gleam of intellectual hunger. "Another locked room mystery, Lestrade? London's criminals seem remarkably consistent in their preference for theatrical impossibilities." As we prepared to venture forth into the spring afternoon, I reflected upon the strange journey that had brought us from Silas Vane's impossible correspondence to this moment of renewed purpose. Holmes gathered his magnifying lens and notebook with practiced efficiency, but I observed in his movements a subtle change, a deeper appreciation for the human complexities that lay beneath even the most puzzling circumstances. Final reflections. "You will complete your account of the Pendleton affair?" Holmes asked as we descended the familiar stairs of Baker Street. "I shall," I confirmed, "though I confess the ending still troubles me. There is no simple moral, no clear triumph of good over evil." Holmes paused on the threshold, his hand upon the door handle. "Because life rarely provides such simplicities, Watson. We deal in human complexity, the gray areas where justice and mercy intersect, where crime and circumstance blur into uncomfortable ambiguity. The letter delivered by a dead man taught us that the most elaborate deceptions often spring from the simplest human emotions: love, grief, and the desperate desire for justice. When legal remedies fail, he opened the door to reveal London bathed in afternoon sunlight, the fog that had dominated our November investigation replaced by the clear air of spring renewal. Perhaps that is the true lesson, that understanding serves us better than judgment, and that even the darkest actions may contain seeds of eventual redemption. As our hansom cab carried us toward whatever new impossibility awaited at the British Museum, I reflected that some mysteries, once solved, continue to resonate far beyond their immediate resolution. The case of the letter delivered by a dead man had begun with forged correspondence and concluded with genuine transformation, not merely of the individuals involved, but of the very systems that had enabled such corruption to flourish. The fog had lifted from Baker Street, spring had come to London, and the eternal game of truth versus deception continued. Yet we approached each new challenge with the hard-won wisdom that justice, however imperfectly achieved, remained worth pursuing, and that even the most elaborate deceptions might ultimately serve truth's greater purpose. Behind us, the warm glow of our Baker Street windows promised eventual return to comfort and contemplation. Ahead lay the unknown, and the irresistible challenge of transforming the impossible into the merely improbable through the careful application of logic, observation, and, perhaps most importantly, understanding of the human heart that beats beneath even the most puzzling circumstances. The game was indeed eternally afoot, but we faced it now with deeper appreciation for both its complexities and its profound importance in maintaining the delicate balance between order and chaos in our fog-shrouded city of secrets.